Crossing the Rhine, March 1945. The last great water barrier protecting Germany. After capturing the bridge at Remagen by luck, Allied forces launched massive, coordinated river crossings all along the Rhine, from Patton's daring night crossing with minimal preparation to Montgomery's elaborate set-piece operation with over 1 million men. These crossings broke Germany's last natural defense line and opened the road into the heart of the Reich, marking the beginning of the final chapter of the war in Europe.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, I want to tell you about the moment when the Allies finally broke into the heart of Germany. After years of fighting across North Africa, Italy, and France, after surviving the Battle of the Bulge, American forces stood at Germany's last great natural barrier, the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had protected Germany from invasion. No foreign army had crossed it in force since Napoleon. But in March 1945, American forces were about to do exactly that. This is the story of the crossing of the Rhine, the operation that shattered Germany's last line of defense and opened the road to final victory. By early March 1945, Allied forces were lined up all along the western bank of the Rhine River. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive had failed, and now the Allies were pushing into Germany itself. But the Rhine stood in their way. The Rhine isn't just any river. In many places, it's over 1,000 feet wide. It's deep, with a strong current. The Germans had spent months preparing defenses on the eastern bank, bunkers, trenches, artillery positions, all designed to massacre any force trying to cross. And the Germans had destroyed every bridge across the Rhine, every single one. Or so they thought. We talked in a previous episode about how the 9th Armored Division captured the bridge at Remagen intact on March 7, 1945. That was an incredible stroke of luck. American forces poured across that bridge before the Germans could organize an effective response. By mid-March 1945, the Americans had a solid bridgehead on the eastern bank at Remagen. But one bridge wasn't enough. The Allied armies needed multiple crossing points to get their massive forces across the Rhine. Eisenhower's plan called for crossing the Rhine at several points along its length. The British under Montgomery would cross in the north. The Americans would cross in the center and south. And they'd do it in March, before the spring floods made the river even more difficult to cross. The first major American assault crossing, not counting the lucky capture at Remagen, happened on the night of March 22, 1945, and it was led by one of the most colorful and aggressive American commanders of the war, General George S. Patton. Patton had been champing at the bit. He'd heard about the Remagen bridge capture and was jealous. He wanted to be first across the Rhine. He wanted the glory. But more than that, he wanted to beat Montgomery, the British field marshal, who was planning an elaborate, carefully prepared crossing operation further north. Patton couldn't stand Montgomery and was determined to cross the Rhine before him.
Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim on March 21st. Patton immediately ordered a crossing for that night. His staff was shocked. They hadn't prepared for this. They didn't have enough boats. They didn't have time for proper reconnaissance. The artillery support wasn't fully in place. Everything about proper military procedure said to wait, prepare, and do it right. But Patton insisted. He wanted to cross now, before Montgomery's operation, and with as little fanfare as possible. He famously told his staff, "I want to get across before Monty starts and grabs all the headlines." On the night of March 22nd, elements of the 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim. They used whatever boats they could find, assault boats, engineer boats, even some commandeered civilian boats. The crossing was done in darkness, with minimal artillery preparation to avoid alerting the Germans. Private First Class Charles Roden from Ohio was in one of the first boats. "We paddled across in the dark. The current was strong, kept pushing us downstream. We could hear Germans on the other side but couldn't see them. When we hit the far bank, we jumped out and ran for cover. Then the shooting started. But we were across. We'd made it. The Germans were surprised by the crossing at Oppenheim. They had expected crossings further north where Allied forces were concentrated. By the time they reacted, American infantry were establishing a foothold on the eastern bank. More boats crossed. Engineers began building pontoon bridges. By dawn, thousands of American soldiers were across the Rhine. Patton was ecstatic. He'd beaten Montgomery across the Rhine. The story goes that when he called his superior, General Bradley, to report the crossing, he said, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley asked, "Where?" Patton replied, "The Rhine. I sneaked a division over last night." Then he added, "There are so few Krauts around, they don't know it yet." The next day, March 23rd, Patton held a press conference to announce his crossing. He made sure to mention that his crossing was done with minimal preparation and casualties, unlike Montgomery's elaborate operation that was just beginning. Patton even made a show of urinating in the Rhine River to show his contempt for the German defenders. But while Patton was grabbing headlines, other American forces were also preparing the cross. The 7th Army under General Patch was planning crossings further south. And in the north, Montgomery's massive operation, codenamed Operation Plunder, was about to begin.
Montgomery's crossing was the complete opposite of Patton's. Where Patton had improvised with minimal preparation, Montgomery prepared meticulously for weeks. He assembled over 1 million men, thousands of pieces of artillery, fleets of boats and bridging equipment. He planned to cross with overwhelming force and massive air and artillery support. Some criticized Montgomery for being too cautious, too slow. But Montgomery believed in thorough preparation. He'd seen too many operations fail because of inadequate preparation. He was going to cross the Rhine with enough force to guarantee success. Operation Plunder began on the night of March 23rd, the night after Patton's crossing. British and American forces, including the U.S. 9th Army, crossed the Rhine near Wesel. The operation was preceded by one of the heaviest artillery barrages of the entire war. Thousands of guns opened fire, pounding German positions for hours. Then came the river crossings. Assault boats, amphibious vehicles, anything that could float, carried soldiers across the Rhine. The Germans fought back, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault. Private First Class James Wilson from Pennsylvania, crossing with the 30th Infantry Division, described it. "The artillery was so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. Then we loaded into the boats and started across. Tracers were flying everywhere. Shells were exploding in the water. Some boats got hit and sank, but most made it across. Once we hit the far bank, we just kept moving forward." The next morning, March 24th, came Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Over 16,000 paratroopers and glider infantry from American and British airborne divisions dropped behind German lines on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Their mission was to capture key terrain and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the river crossings. The airborne operation was costly. The aircraft approached in daylight, and German anti-aircraft fire was heavy. Many planes were shot down. Gliders crashed. Paratroopers landed in the middle of German positions and had to fight immediately. But they accomplished their mission, seizing bridges and road junctions and disrupting German defenses. Staff Sergeant Frank Dillon from Illinois, a paratrooper with the 17th Airborne Division, later recalled, "We jumped in broad daylight and could see the whole battlefield below us. German flak was so thick it looked like you could walk on it. I saw planes exploding in mid-air, gliders crashing. But we landed and immediately attacked. We took our objectives and held them until the ground forces linked up with us."
Within 24 hours of the start of Operation Plunder, Montgomery had over 30,000 men and hundreds of tanks across the Rhine. Engineers were building permanent bridges. The crossing was a complete success. By the end of March, American and British forces had multiple bridgeheads across the Rhine. The river that was supposed to be Germany's impregnable defensive line had been breached in multiple places. German forces on the western bank were being mopped up. The path into Germany lay open. But these weren't the only Rhine crossings. Up and down the river, American forces found crossing points and got across. Some crossings were elaborate operations with full planning and support. Others were opportunistic, commanders finding a weak spot and getting troops across before the Germans could react. The 3rd Armored Division found an intact bridge at Oppenheim, not the railroad bridge like at Remagen, but a pontoon bridge the Germans had failed to destroy. American tanks rolled across before the Germans knew what was happening. The 89th Infantry Division crossed near St. Goar, ferrying troops across under cover of darkness and smoke. The 87th Infantry Division crossed near Koblenz. Each crossing put more American troops on German soil, expanded the bridgeheads, and stretched German defenses thinner. For the German army, the Rhine crossings were a disaster. They'd counted on the Rhine to buy time, to slow the Allied advance. They'd hoped to hold the river line for weeks or even months, trading time for a chance to reorganize their shattered forces. But the Rhine was crossed in days, not months. And once the Allies were across in force, there was no stopping them. Germany had no more natural barriers to hide behind, no more rivers, no more mountains that could be defended, just open country, perfect for the kind of mobile warfare American armor excelled at. The Rhine crossings also marked a psychological turning point. For years, the Rhine had been Germany's shield, the symbol of German invulnerability. No foreign army had crossed it successfully in over a century. But now American tanks were rolling across pontoon bridges, American infantry were digging in on the eastern bank, and American artillery was firing into the German heartland. For German soldiers and civilians, the Rhine crossings meant the war was lost. Some kept fighting out of duty, discipline, or fear of what would happen if they surrendered. But many knew it was over. The Allies were in Germany, and nothing could stop them now.
For American soldiers, crossing the Rhine was a milestone. They'd fought all the way from Normandy, or Italy, or North Africa. They'd survived battles that had killed many of their friends. And now they were in Germany itself, approaching the end. Private First Class Robert Johnson from Georgia, who'd landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, wrote to his wife after crossing the Rhine, "We're in Germany now. We've come a long way since that terrible day on the beach. Lost a lot of good men along the way. But we're here, and we're going to finish this. Maybe, just maybe, I'll be home by summer." The logistics of getting armies across the Rhine were staggering. Engineers worked around the clock building pontoon bridges. Some bridges were built under fire, with German artillery trying to destroy them as fast as they were built. Engineer casualties were heavy. These men worked exposed, often in the open, perfect targets for German gunners. Supply troops worked to get ammunition, fuel, and food across the bridges to the forces on the eastern bank. Traffic control was crucial. You couldn't have tanks trying to cross at the same time as supply trucks. Military police directed traffic, kept things moving, prevented bottlenecks. The bridges themselves were engineering marvels. Heavy pontoon bridges that could support tanks and trucks, built in sections and floated into place, anchored against the strong current. Some bridges were over 1,000 feet long. They had to be strong enough to carry heavy loads, flexible enough to handle the river's movement, and built fast enough to get forces across before German counterattacks.
Captain James Edwards from Wisconsin, an engineer officer, described building a bridge under fire. "We worked in shifts around the clock. German artillery would hit the bridge or the approaches. We'd take casualties, repair the damage, and keep building. The infantry needed that bridge. They were across the river and needed supplies and reinforcements. We weren't going to let them down, no matter what it took." Once across the Rhine, in force, Allied strategy shifted. Eisenhower decided to focus on encircling and destroying the remaining German forces in the Ruhr industrial region, rather than racing straight for Berlin. This decision was controversial. Some, including Churchill, thought the Allies should race for Berlin before the Soviets got there. But Eisenhower believed destroying German military forces was more important than capturing the capital. American forces spread out across Germany. Some headed north to cut off German forces in the Ruhr. Others drove east, deep into Germany. Patton's Third Army turned south, heading for Bavaria and Austria. The Seventh Army pushed through southern Germany toward Munich.
The advance after the Rhine crossings was remarkably fast. Towns and cities that would have taken days or weeks to capture fell in hours. German resistance was collapsing. Some units fought hard, especially SS units and Hitler Youth, but many German soldiers were ready to surrender. They were out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of hope. American soldiers had mixed feelings as they advanced through Germany. On one hand, they were winning. The end was in sight. On the other hand, they were now seeing the German homeland, seeing German civilians, seeing the devastation that years of Allied bombing had caused. Some soldiers felt sympathy for German civilians, especially children and elderly people who clearly weren't Nazis and were just trying to survive. Others remembered what the Germans had done, the concentration camps that were being discovered, the devastation in countries Germany had occupied, the friends they'd lost fighting the German army. As American forces advanced, they began discovering the concentration camps. Dachau, which we discussed in a previous episode, Buchenwald, Nordhausen. The horrors they found in these camps erased any sympathy soldiers might have felt for Germany. These discoveries made it clear what the war had been about, what they'd been fighting against. The Rhine crossings in March 1945 effectively ended the war in Western Europe, though fighting would continue for another 6 weeks. Once the Allies were across the Rhine in force, Germany couldn't stop them. The only question was how long it would take. For the soldiers who crossed the Rhine, it was a moment of achievement. They'd reached Germany's last great barrier and overcome it. They'd proven that no German defense, no matter how strong, could stop the Allied advance. The Rhine, which Germans had believed would protect them, had fallen in days. Today, if you drive through the Rhine Valley in Germany, you can see where some of these crossings took place. There are markers and memorials at Remagen, where the lucky capture of the bridge happened, at Oppenheim, where Patton crossed, at Wessel, where Montgomery's massive operation took place. The bridges are gone now. The temporary pontoon bridges were removed after the war, replaced by permanent structures. But the river is still there, still wide, still impressive. Looking at it today, it's hard to imagine soldiers crossing it under fire, engineers building bridges while shells fell around them, tank columns rolling across fragile pontoon bridges into enemy territory. But that's what happened in March 1945. American soldiers, along with their British and Canadian allies, crossed the Rhine. They broke Germany's last natural defense. They opened the road to victory.
And in doing so, they showed the world that no barrier, no defense, no river could stop them. The crossing of the Rhine was the beginning of the end. Within weeks, American and Soviet forces would meet in the heart of Germany. Within 2 months, Germany would surrender. The war in Europe would be over. But in March 1945, standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine, looking east into Germany, American soldiers knew they were making history. They were the first American forces to cross the Rhine in force. They were bringing the war to Germany's homeland, and they were going to finish what they'd started on D-Day 10 months earlier. The Rhine crossings, from Patton's improvised assault at Oppenheim to Montgomery's massive set-piece operation, to the dozens of smaller crossings up and down the river, showed American military capability at its best. The ability to conduct complex river crossings under fire, the engineering skill to build bridges quickly, the logistical capability to supply forces on the far bank, the tactical skill to establish and expand bridgeheads, and most importantly, the courage of soldiers willing to cross a river under fire, not knowing what waited on the other side. Thank you for listening, and never forget what those soldiers accomplished in March 1945 when they crossed the Rhine and broke into the heart of Germany. Their courage and determination opened the road to final victory and brought the war in Europe to its end.
The crossing of the Rhine came at a terrible cost. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded, many more traumatized for life. Families received devastating telegrams. The Rhine, once a symbol of German invincibility, was now stained with blood, frost, and the courage of men who had fought relentlessly. Wars like this prove nothing but suffering and loss. They destroy lives, dreams, and innocence. Those who start wars are cowards, playing with the lives of brave men, and they leave a trail of tragedy behind them. The soldiers who crossed the Rhine showed courage, honor, and determination, but the war itself, it was cruelty in motion, and nothing heroic about the destruction it caused. Casualties estimate: American soldiers killed 12,000 to 15,000, wounded 35,000 to 40,000. German losses: 50,000 killed, tens of thousands captured or wounded. Countless lives permanently changed, families devastated. The Rhine crossing marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but the human cost was staggering. War is horror, and no victory can erase the lives it claims.